Video 3 is all about the section about America setting its eyes on the Pacific. Eyes on the Pacific. Write that down. Take good notes. Here we go. So when we talk about eyes on the Pacific, we're talking about overseas conquest. That means what can we do overseas? Where can we go overseas? And once we get there, what are we going to get? So Japan, picture it. 1853, they had opened up trade with the U.S. Commodore Matthew Perry kind of makes certain that they do this because Japan initially didn't really want to. Japan had been an isolated country, meaning we're just going to deal with ourselves. We're not going to deal with other people. We're going to stick to our own and we're going to mind our own business. However, when a Commodore like Matthew Perry shows up with an entire fleet and says, hey, you're going to trade with us because we're going to make you and we've got the power to do so. Remember, militarism, imperialism, people going in with these big attitudes, trying to take over other places. Japan says, okay, we'll trade with you. So what? But they also see it as an opportunity. If they start trading with other powers in the world, it also gives them an opportunity to step their game up and also to grow in their influence and power. Japan is not then what we now know it to be. They're not very developed. They're not big in industry. You're not seeing labels that says everything is made in Japan like we do today. So it kind of works out in Japan's favor because they grow astronomically in economic and political power as well as in influence. Picture it, Alaska. 1867. We call this particular incident Seward's Folly. Seward was the guy who was representing the U.S. He goes and says, you know what? We're going to purchase Alaska from the Russians. Why? Because we want to grow and expand the United States. So he wrote a check, picture it, for $7.2 million to the Russian government to buy Alaska off their hands. Some people say, hey, guy, is this a joke? They consider Alaska to be a massive wasteland. Who's there other than polar bears and Eskimos? But it comes to find out that Alaska had some pretty good natural resources. So, hey, some people came to see maybe the U.S. made a good decision here in purchasing, this massive iceberg. I don't know. Depends on how you feel about it. It's your opinion. The nation that pretty much favored isolationism, the U.S. that is, let's pretty much kind of stay among ourselves. But then as they're starting to look over toward Europe, they're starting to see all of this imperialism. They're starting to see people building their economic and political empires and control. And then, of course, if you're an American, you might go, hey, if we kind of don't catch up with this, maybe we're going to start falling behind. And that's not exactly what we want to do. In 1893, there was something developed called the Turner, Turner, thesis. The Turner thesis stated that the Western frontier is what defines all of American history because it talks about this time period where America is pushing west and America is driven by the need to grow. And this becomes known, according to Turner, as the most pivotal part of American history. When America makes up its mind that it must grow, that it must develop, that it must advance, that this becomes our identity and defines who we are. Expansionism is fueled by this idea of Anglo-Saxon superiority. No offense, but essentially that means it's this idea that, hey, we white people, Anglo-Saxons, we are the people who God has given and shed his glorious light on. We know what the rest of the world needs to do, so everybody needs to get like us, everybody needs to be like us, and everybody needs to follow our example. So they're even going to believe that they must take their Christian values and their Western civilization to the rest of the world. I'll give you a second to let that sink in. Okay. Supporters of expansionism started to look toward the Pacific Islands. When I say the Pacific Islands, when's the last time you looked at a map? I'm talking about small places like Samoa. In 1899, America comes to possess some of the Samoan Islands after having some conflicts with Germany and Great Britain. In 1898, they start to look toward Hawaii. Yeah, that's right. Hawaii wasn't always a part of the U.S. It was annexed in 1898. And there's this open door policy that develops at that time. Write that down. Open door policy. That policy is directed specifically at China. So China is a good place to trade, or so we say, but China doesn't necessarily want to be considered this place that the rest of the world wants to come in and play and trade with. China doesn't want to play in the sandbox with other countries. So some people try to prevent it. Something happens called the Boxer Rebellion. It is a protest, and just like it sounds, it was a major rebellion. However, the Chinese fail, and ultimately, they become a whole lot more open to the rest of the world than they really want it to be. So we're going to see a lot of people starting to move into China now, starting to trade, starting to take possession of some of their resources, and you're going to see this happen in other places as well. There was a rebellion in Cuba that led to something called reconcentration. So you've heard of concentration camps later in history with World War II, Germany, Jews. So this actually happens earlier, and it's called reconcentration, and it happens to Cuban citizens. We're going to move you into areas that we want you to be, and that's where you're going to have to stay because we're the government, and that's what we say. Keep in mind, this is not America doing this. This is what Cuba was doing. So now you have people in the American government going, hey, America, you're growing in your influence in the world. Hey, you're supposed to be the watchdog of the globe. You need to go into Cuba and do something about this. Initially, America says, not my problem, not my business, I'm staying out of it. But ultimately, the U.S. finds itself being pulled in to this situation, and they go in and they do so. In 1898, there's this Spanish-American conflict. It winds up with a treaty being signed that gave the U.S. Puerto Rico, the Philippines, Guam, and a small place called Wake. So the U.S. acquires these new territories after going at it with the Spanish. The U.S. is also going to develop a protectorate, Protectorate, a protectorate relationship with Cuba, which says, hey, Cuba, we're going to allow you, imagine that, we are going to allow you to remain an independent country whose policies we get to control. So you're not going to always do the right thing. So we're going to watch what you do. And if you step out of line, we're going to put you in check and we're going to make you come correct. So this is what kind of happens between America and Cuba at this time. Also, turn your attention to the Panama Canal. In 1904, they had this idea. We need to link the two oceans, the Atlantic and the Pacific. And this canal is going to help us do so. Only problem is you got to go through Colombian territory. And I don't know how much you know about the Colombians, but they're not always nice people. So, of course, it leads to a conflict. The canal takes 10 years to build. Yeah, there's conflict with the people, but there's also the issue of sickness. People keep getting sick with malaria and yellow fever, among other things. I mean, you're in a strange population with other diseases and other germs that your body's not used to, not to mention you're trying to dig a canal, so you're kind of wading around in a lot of water all the time. Not a good combination of things. So Wilson, at this time, is going to be that president who says, I got it. I know what I need to do. You need to speak softly, but you need to carry a big stick and you'll go far. So Roosevelt comes along with the corollary. And he says, here's what we're going to do then. A corollary is an extension of a policy or doctrine. So he says, I'm going to build on what already was. He builds on the Monroe Doctrine, among other things. And he said, hey, the U.S. is the bona fide leader of the Western Hemisphere. So any issues with our neighbors means we have a right to intervene and restore order. And Roosevelt comes along and says, we need to use our big stick in Latin America, and that's exactly what we're going to do. Taft, that guy who preceded Teddy Roosevelt, he wanted diplomacy. He said, let's not beat people with a big stick. Let's connect it to money. Let's connect it to trade. But it winds up leading to just as much conflict as using Roosevelt's big stick. So at the end of the day, when you want to know what it is I want you to know about the Pacific, you might want to know some of the nations that the U.S. acquires, figure out how we grew to the extent that we did and what they had to do to get it. Did we do it through trade and diplomacy? Did we do it through big stick absolutely, at the end of the day, America has set itself up to be a number one player on the world's stage. That, my friends, is how we became the watchdog of the world.